We're now going to move on to the final session this morning before we break for a short lunch break. And this session is focused on a subject that has been referred to already today, and I'm not surprised about that in the context of a technology forum. And that subject is ransomware. And the subject today is being addressed through the lenses of prevention, detection and response. So what a timely subject this is, whilst earlier this week Colonial in the US had yet to share information with the federal government about the vulnerability that the ransomware group DarkSide took advantage of to infiltrate the fuel company. A top Biden administration cybersecurity official warned the Senate hearing that cyber attacks on the nation's infrastructure are, and I quote, growing more sophisticated, frequent and aggressive. It seems that DarkSide is based in Eastern Europe and carries out double extortion ransomware attacks, where they both encrypt a victim's data and then also steal some of that data and then threaten to release it to cause reputational damage if the victim doesn't pay, which means even if a victim has strong backups for their data that allow them to restore the data that was encrypted, the bad actor still has another way to extort the victim. And I think it's very interesting that there are also stories emerging that DarkSide probably were more effective in their attack than they intended to be. So even mistakes can create chaos. Now, you'll all be delighted to know that this is where my knowledge starts to run out. Unfortunately, I can turn to our panel of experts today. First of all, I would like to welcome Jayan Pereira, Head of Cyber Response at Control Risks. Jayan is the Director leading the Control Risk Cybersecurity Response Team, which includes responsibility for supporting clients during cyber incidents and crises. He and his team regularly respond to complex extortion cyber attacks, such as ransomware, and spearhead the overall organisational response to those issues, working closely with legal counsel and other external experts. In these scenarios, Jayan has a blend of experience in response, solution implementation, strategy and governance and threat intelligence, and has previously supported the implementation of enterprise-wide, not the last time we'll hear that today, security tools as part of the long-term security transformation projects. Before he joined Control Risks, Jayan was a cybersecurity specialist at Deloitte, where he delivers security consulting projects in industries such as energy and resources, finance, insurance, telecoms and media. Jayan, welcome. I'd then like to welcome Greg Anderson, who's a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills. Greg is in the Insurance Disputes Group with a broad experience of acting for policyholders, brokers, insurers and reinsurers. He advises clients in all sectors and leads the cyber and data privacy risk element of HSF's insurance practice in London. His experience extends across all types of insurance and reinsurance, and he has acted on some of the largest and most complex cyber losses in the market. Greg is ranked in the Legal 500 UK 2021 as the next generation partner for both insurance litigation, for policyholders and insurance and reinsurance. Welcome, Greg. Then I'd like to move on to Ben Hobby, who is a partner in Baker Tilly. For the last 17 years, Ben has handled losses and investigations of various scopes and sizes for insurers, lawyers and corporates across the globe. His expertise focuses on cyber risk and systems failure, physical and non-physical damage, business interruption, fraud and investigations. Ben leads Baker Tilly's global cyber insurance practice and has managed some of the largest cyber losses handled by the London insurance market. Ben is a member of and current chair of the Cyber Claims Committee and the International Underwriting Association, which addresses issues relating to the handling of cyber claims in the London insurance market. He's also authored a chapter on cyber business interruption in a book soon to be published by the Chartered Insurance Institute. And then I'd like to move on to representatives from Lloyd's. Firstly, Louise Smith, who joined Lloyd's in 2020 from RBS, where she spent 8 years in a role as head of intelligent automation and head of digitalization for personal and business banking. She's also spent time with the Treasury as a fintech envoy. Louise is a board member of FinTech Scotland and an advisor to Fujitsu as a director of innovation in financial services. And as I mentioned earlier, just yesterday, it was announced that Louise is the next chair of Innovate Finance, the industry body representing UK FinTech, a role that I believe, Lou, you start in July. And I believe also that you are joined today, Louise, by a colleague, Matthew Broomhall, who is your Chief Information Security Officer with you at Lloyd's. Okay, so welcome. What a fantastic panel we've got. So we want to get the most out of your knowledge, and we're going to ask you to share, bearing in mind the title of the session, we'd like you to share your perspective, looking through the lenses of those subjects, and then we're going to line up a snappy Q&A to drill into some of the subjects that you cover. And I'm going to ask Jehan to start off our session. And I think, Jehan, you've probably also got a slide that you want to share with us as you talk through the words that you would like to share. So, Jehan, I'd like you to start. I'd like you to hand over to Greg, Greg to hand over to Ben, and then Ben to hand over to Louise, rather than me pop up and down on the screen. So if that's okay with you, away we go. And Jehan, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Julia. And good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be on the panel today and to speak to you about this very topical subject, I think, ransomware at the moment. Definitely something that during the pandemic has been a real thorn in the side of a number of organizations, primarily down to the fact that so many of us, well, almost all of us are working from home, I'd hope. And as a result, it's much harder to coordinate any response to any kind of crisis, let alone a technology crisis. The slide that I have, which hopefully will pop up in a second, is essentially just a very brief introduction to some of the key issues I think relating to ransomware. And what I wanted to do just for the first few minutes is give everyone a sort of a quick 10,000 feet view from myself as to where this has come from, what we're experiencing right now, and where we think this is going. And hopefully that will lead into Greg's next piece as well. So I think Julia mentioned earlier this sort of double extortion piece. Ransomware right now is very much focused on that. That is definitely the trend that we're seeing. But it hasn't always been like that. Ransomware has been around for a little while. In its previous iterations, it's always been focused on impacting the availability of systems. And the view there was if you can take some systems offline, if you can encrypt it and force someone to pay a ransom to decrypt it, and you get a good enough system, well, then your quid's in, at least from the attacker's perspective. However, what they realized through that process was that businesses were getting better at protecting themselves, they were having better backups in place. And so all the effort that went in from the attacker's side to encrypt systems wasn't necessarily paying off. And what we've seen over the last 2 years or so has been a movement to this double extortion piece where you have both data being encrypted but also stolen, and that theft element is something completely outside of the control of the business. Even if it can restore its systems, the fact that data may have left the network brings with it a number of regulatory concerns as well as commercial and client concerns that go alongside it. And I think this is really what has sort of led the step change in the sort of the sheer scale of ransomware attacks that we're seeing right now. Ransomware is probably the most commonly responded to attack in control risks. It's something that we see on a daily basis now, and it's something that is not specific to just one industry, which is also something quite interesting about ransomware itself. It is spread across many different industries and sizes. We respond to lots of different attacks at large corporate, to a FTSE 100, Fortune 100, but also other attacks that are down in sort of the SME market. And I think this really shows that the size and scale of these criminal enterprises that are driving ransomware are massive. They are not just single entities. They often run sort of affiliate schemes where there will be one central organization who will be producing the next best variant of ransomware as an actual piece of virus or malware. But then they will use an affiliate network of attackers who will be proving that they have access to networks, who will spend their time getting vulnerabilities through, phishing individuals, getting access to the networks, then getting a partnership in place with those ransomware groups and running that ransomware across the network once they've proven they have had access. So it's a really complex ecosystem of criminals there. And what that means from an organizational perspective when you're responding is that the impacts of these attacks are quite significant. It's not just the financial losses. Of course, you've got the business interruption that comes with it, the response costs of having individuals like ourselves who are on this call supporting you through that process. But you've also got the ransom payment. And not only is that logistically difficult to do, because do you want to do that, but also what is the method for doing that, and doing that within the existing regulation that exists now from OFAC, but also the regulatory fines that might be associated with any data that's also been exfiltrated off the network. How do we minimize that? So I think ransomware is not just a cyber issue, it's not just a technology issue. I think what makes this quite difficult for businesses to manage at the moment is that it's actually a cross-departmental issue when it does manifest in its most extreme forms. And the last two things I'll say is that data extortion has always sort of gone in and out of fashion within cyber attacks. We know sort of 5 years ago that there was a lot of doxing style attacks where people would get sensitive information about executives, send an email saying that I've got a picture of you in a compromising position, pay me this much money. And that's always been a facet and feature of the cyber landscape. But what's different today, I think, with ransomware is the fact that, one, this is happening at scale, and two, it's being added onto an existing proven extortion method, which is now feeding the beast, as it were, when it comes to the criminal ecosystem. And lots of different groups are popping up, and as soon as their sort of reputation gets tarnished, they shut down shop, they appear as a new group, and off they go again. So reputation is really important. And the last thing I'll say is this is a global issue. On the right hand side of this slide, we have a sort of a heat map of where these attacks are taking place. The reality is that although you can see that sort of North America and Western Europe is sort of the primary target for these kinds of attacks, it's actually happening all over the world, whether you're in China, whether you're in Russia, sort of typical adversaries of the Western states. Actually, it's happening everywhere. And again, it goes to the fact that actually this is impacting organizations and individuals across the globe, which is why I think it also requires a slightly broader cross-border initiative to try and bring some of these criminal groups to justice in the wider term as well. But hopefully that's a sort of a reasonable introduction. I'll hand over to Greg now to give his thoughts as well.
Thanks very much, Jay, and good morning, just about still, everyone. Our experience as a firm very much reflects what we're hearing in the wider market as to the uptick in ransomware, particularly over the last year or so. And when one is responding to these kinds of events, we have a global team, and one needs to cross a number of different practice areas: cyber, data privacy, regulatory crime, insurance, corporate governance, to bring the skill set to bear to deal with these incidents, given the complexity that Jay has just been describing. But prevention and detection, of course, starts much earlier. The onset of ransomware will be sudden. You can't get into your system. You've got the box appearing on screen inviting you to get in touch, but the hackers may have been in your system for weeks or even months, investigating it, getting ready for that one moment. And therefore, of course, to work on prevention, you need to be at the stage earlier than that. Your IT security is going to be important. When one is in the current environment and personal data is a key tool that the hackers are using, that's one of the crown jewels that you'd want your IT security particularly to be directed towards. But the regulators are looking at this as an even broader concept: operational resilience. Not just do I have the right IT security, but do I have the right incident management plans in place? How good is my business at responding when it goes down and getting back up again? How resilient is it? Now, what we tend to see is then the hackers happen. Inevitably, it's going to happen for some businesses, no matter how much you spend on IT security. They're very complex and sophisticated outfits in some case. And the question is then, well, what happens next? How am I going to respond? And I thought I might just pick out a few thoughts that we had on that. The first being communications. Your email may be down, your telephone system may be down. Do you have a plan B comms network, whether that be as simple as WhatsApp or a bespoke platform like Evergrid, for example? Can you speak to each other? Do you have the docs? Getting the right team in place earlier. Are you ready for that? Both internally and externally, the kinds of people on this call, forensics, PR, legal, instant response, negotiators who can deal with the random event. You need the team up and running. One then needs to think about, well, what does my timeline look like to get my system back up and running? I might have backups, but backups might take days or even weeks in some cases to fully restore, and even that won't fix it. In the meantime, if I haven't paid the ransom, am I still even viable as a going concern 1 or 2 weeks from now? For some businesses, yes. For others, no. So it's a really tricky decision. Do I pay or not? And one has to look at what the time frame looks like with that. Law enforcement, that's a tricky question because it can be strategic. It seems obvious, but are you notifying the police, the National Crime Agency, the NCSC? Have I detected the hackers before the event? And are there sensitivities around how I'm going to manage that without tipping them off that I know they're there? And how do I deal with law enforcement on that? What does my insurance policy say about what I need to do with law enforcement and what level of cooperation is required in that context? And then you have the ransom itself. Can I pay it? Is it legal to pay this ransom? And the answer in principle is yes, one can pay ransoms, but there are restrictions on that. So if you're paying a sanctioned individual or group, you're not going to be able to pay. If you might be paying a suspected terrorist, you're not going to be able to pay. So one needs to do the most possible to get to the bottom of that, but timing is going to be tight. Businesses are going to be looking at, is the hacker trustworthy? And these groups often operate as businesses. There is experience of whether or not they're likely to hand you your data back. And one needs experienced professionals who know the group to then answer that kind of question. There are regulatory notification obligations, whether that be data privacy to the ICO in the UK, financial services regulated firms may need to notify the FCA and so on. Different sectors will have different regulators, but where one's dealing with a global event and cyber isn't jurisdictionally specific, you may need to be looking at different jurisdictions, working out which regulators. And then there are some pretty tight notification obligations in some jurisdictions, hours rather than days in some cases to notify. You might have a 4-hour obligation and it takes 3 hours to fill out the form. So it's pretty quick that one needs to be on top of this. And then is your insurance going to pay? That's a big question. Increasingly, we're seeing businesses not only using insurance to pay, but attacks being directed at businesses with insurance to try and use that insurance pot. That means one needs to make sure the insurance, if you do have it, is there. And it might be under crime or cyber or kidnap and ransom. So you need to be on top of that before the incident. So you know which policy to pick up. Policy is unlikely to pay if the payment of the ransom would be illegal, sanctions and terrorism and so on. So the business needs to know that. So one needs the right people in the business who are making these decisions to have the insurance knowledge fed through to them. So that could be taken into account. The tail can't wag the dog, but it needs to be one of the factors in the decision-making room that is thought about. And this isn't just insurance for the ransom itself. It's the wider suite of losses. So cyber is instant response costs, data breach claims, cost of reg investigations, potentially data privacy fines, loss of profits. Your PI policy might be loss of service claims by customers. The D&O policy may be securities claims or regulatory investigations into individuals. And one needs to know that at the beginning, because the first thing that you may need to do is pick up your phone to the right insurer. If there's an instant response team under your cyber policy or your K&R, do you have that telephone number to hand in the first half an hour to get onto the right team and get those individuals plugged in? And then carrying that team and the insurance market with you and engaging is by far the best way to get covered, both because the expertise can help you deal with the incident, but also because notification obligations, consent obligations, and so on and so forth need to be complied with. And if everyone's pulling in the same direction and it's agreed that decisions are sensible decisions, it just makes it that much easier further down the line to realise the value of that that insurance product that the premium's been paid for in the first place. So I think my rule there is just be ready, think about it in advance, so you're not dusting off the insurance policies as the first thing you're doing in the first couple of hours, and then trying to work out what to do, or even worse than that, not thinking about them until a couple of months later, and then hoping that the policy responds because you haven't breached anything. But with that, I think I'll probably pass over to Ben.
Thanks, Greg. And I think that theme of preparedness is absolutely critical to the response side of these incidents. The aim of any response is obviously to minimise the financial losses that a company is going to incur. So having a good quality response plan, look, it goes without saying, it's absolutely critical. But the key to that response, that's in the pre-incident planning. And I think what companies often forget with a cyber incident, a property incident, that's localized. That's only going to be affecting a small part of what could be a global business. Cyber, that's going to be enterprise-wide and potentially across an entire global business. So therefore, the need to move quickly is amplified almost exponentially. So therefore, there isn't time to think about what you're going to be doing. There isn't time to plan. You should have done that already, so that the plan then basically hits the road and the business then starts to recover. And in our experience, the business interruption loss will usually be lower for a company that has that well thought out and well executed incident response plan compared to a company without that. But I think it's also useful just to actually kind of give some thought as to what that response plan really needs to consider. Greg's already made the point that you can't ignore the cyber insurance policy, so make sure the incident response plan and the policy are working very much hand in hand. But one of the first things that I think needs to be considered is, look, does the network infrastructure need to be 100% rebuilt? I know there is a debate going on around that at the moment, but there are services out there where the Active Directory can be monitored for activity that then prevents the need for a full rebuild. Again, that's going to compress the potential time to get the network fully reinstated. You're also going to need a full list of all of the servers and applications that are used on the network, so you can then prioritize those applications that are critical to operations, critical to your ability to generate revenues. So you can then prioritize the servers upon which those applications operate, and obviously then the applications themselves. That then speeds up your ability to then start servicing customers again. We've spoken about backups, already, but the status of those, are they on local disk, tape, or even in the cloud? Are they segregated? Are they complete? We've certainly seen claims where there's been issues regarding the completeness of the backups. But before an incident occurs, make sure they've been tested. You know that those backups are reliable and can be used. And if the backups are in the cloud, think about how you're going to recover those. Trying to send a substantial backup down a telephone line, that's going to take weeks. You'll be quicker getting somebody on a plane, going to the data center and taking an image of what the data center's got. Back to that into the plan. That's focusing though on data. But what about backups of bespoke code? Any business is going to have a number of applications that are critical to how that business operates, and they're going to be provided by different vendors. They need to talk to each other, and that's where that bespoke code comes in. Is that code backed up? If not, then you're going to have a problem with getting the business recovered. Legacy applications and hardware, look, we all know it exists, and sometimes there's a very good reason why it exists. But trying to ensure that you've got the ability to restore those legacy systems, because you're going to need them for your business going forward. Make sure the plan considers that. And then all of that information from our perspective as forensic accountants, we can then start to get a feel for how long there's going to be no operational activity or reduced operational activity. We can understand the revenue impact of that. We can start having a conversation as to how customers are going to react to that. And also then, what are the other additional costs that are going to be incurred to help mitigate against that business interruption loss? The key thing is have that plan and make sure it's tested. And I'm sure Louise and Matthew probably have some additional comments to add on to that.
Thanks, Ben. And this probably shows just what happens when Julia asks for any support from Lloyds and me. We are more than happy to support Julia, and I'm delighted we've also got Matt, who's our expert in Lloyds, and also with some incredible broader industry experience, particularly in travel and tourism, where he's also spent a big chunk of time. Listen, I'm nowhere near the experts of my colleagues on the panel, but let me give you a slightly different perspective about what worries me in the role that I play as the digital lead in Lloyds. And it's 5 things that I'm probably more focused on. And I'm going to start with the customer. So let me give you just some brief views, because I'd love to get to the panel and I'd love to get Matt to give a couple of minutes on his view. Is you almost have to now prepare that at some point your data is going to get hacked in some way, and whatever that then flows off in terms of ransomware, cyber attacks, loss, etc. If you start from that basis, you know that you then have to think about what levels of defence do you put around that to respond quickly and actually restore customer faith. So those are the things that worry me. And this isn't a technical challenge at all. In fact, it's also a cultural one. So what are those lines of defence around people awareness and also technology, systems and data? So that's the point that worries me first, is that cultural awareness and the impact on customer faith and customer confidence as we go through. Thirdly is then around, particularly in today's environment, in pandemics, or when there are challenges or issues, these types of communities, and I think Julia's example is a good one, they target vulnerability. In fact, they pull on vulnerability so that actually it creates that greater void as people move forward. So those are one of the areas I think in all of the pandemic as we've gone through this, not just with ransomware, but also with customers, is how attacks have targeted vulnerabilities in individuals and businesses. And we've seen that grow. So you've got that cultural awareness, you've got that erosion of customer confidence, you've got that targeting of vulnerability, and then there's those last areas around, and that's why I say there's no complete defence from this. And I think the panel have already articulated big questions that you need to ask. And there isn't a complete defence. So it's how do you create those layers of defence, but also that limited impact. And then the very last point is what happens if it happens. So where's the playbook? Does everybody know what role they play, so that you can recover quickly? So I think it's that recover quickly and restore confidence and faith as quick as you can. There's a number of examples. I've not seen so many here, but I've seen some in my previous roles in retail banking, where you've seen businesses and organisations, their focus was on getting transparency, being open and honest about what happened, and really focusing on that customer strategy to restore faith and confidence quickly, where you see people actually come out of this and well. But it's those areas that worry me most. And particularly if you think about digital, we organise everything around customer journeys. What data do you need to drive those journeys? And how does that all flow through? So understanding those vulnerabilities through those journeys is fundamental. And then when something does go wrong, how quickly can you respond to it? So I know I've only spoken for a couple of minutes, but I'd like to give Matt an opportunity to give his view, and hopefully there's some hooks there, Matt, that you can then talk to.
Sure, thanks Lou, and hello everybody. So yeah, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Lloyds. Previously, I was the Chief Information Security Officer at TUI, the holiday company, which would be an interesting business during a global pandemic, as you can imagine. I concur with a lot of the views of the panel here. You know, what we're seeing in the world is over the last few years is a real growth in the professionalisation of cybercrime around ransomware, entrepreneurial even. The latest one that I heard of just this week, there is now a group that is offering early information about organisations that are about to be ransomwared for the purpose of insider trading, so that people can short sell on stocks and things like that. So it's a space that cyber criminals are being really innovative around, actually, and I don't think it's going away. It is something that just comes with the digital transformation of society, that we're now so reliant on data as an economy, organisations, in our personal lives, that this ransomware category of crime goes alongside it, unfortunately. And to the cyber criminals, it's very lucrative, it's low risk, and it's not that hard to do. And as a number of people have said on this panel, it is impossible for any organisation or individual to completely eliminate the risk of this happening. You can reduce the likelihood. You can make it more difficult for the cyber criminals to attack you. And that's important because cyber criminals are rational individuals. They aim to make the most money with the least effort possible. So if you make it more difficult, they may well go on to the next organisation. However, many of our agendas in our organisations are making the size of the prize to the criminals bigger. At Lloyds, we have Blueprint 2, which Louise is driving here. Blueprint 2 will make us a more attractive organisation to attack, because if any of those services that we build get attacked, we're that much more likely to pay the ransom, because these services become fundamental parts of the entire insurance sector. So since the value to the criminals is going up to attack us, we need to work hard to increase the effort for those criminals to attack us. So maybe what I'd just like to do is maybe talk about a few of the things, the practical things that an organisation can do to reduce the likelihood.
Could I make one comment, Matt? We've got about 12 minutes left, and I'd really like to make sure that we've got some time at the end for a couple of Q&As, if that's okay with you.
Would you like me to finish with 10 minutes to go?
Yes, please, if you could.
All right now.
Thank you.
Okay, so just a few practical things that any organisation can do to make a cyber attack less likely. So the first one is having a really good awareness programme. Every person that works for your organisation is important in protecting against cybercrime, because hackers usually target humans, individuals first. It's often seen as a technology issue, but the actual techniques of cyber criminals is often to attack the human. So your awareness programme is really important, and cybersecurity needs to be seen as part of everyone's job, and not just the information security team. So that's number one. The second one has been mentioned by some of my colleagues here, and that is to have a really good understanding of what your most critical systems are and focus your efforts to secure those. Because you'll probably find that 80% of the risk sits with a relatively small number of key systems and processes. So instead of trying to secure everything, which is nearly impossible, focus on those critical services. Those are the most practical things that I think that every organisation can do to reduce the likelihood of it happening to you. But as others have mentioned, it probably still could happen to you. And so you need to also think about how effectively you are prepared to respond. And that is all the things that my colleagues here have been talking about in preparing for your incident response plan, having those tabletop exercises around real scenarios so that you are practiced in the art of responding without it happening to you. And then the other big thing to do is make sure you're able to recover. And others have mentioned it here, backups. Have you got backups of those critical systems, and have you tested that you can recover from those backups? That will be the biggest thing that can minimise your impact, and that is with 10 minutes to go. Thanks, Julie.
Brilliant.
Julia.
Thank you very much indeed. And gosh, a wealth of great information there, and sharing of thoughts. So thank you so much, all of you, for that. So I would like to get in a couple of questions that we've got, if I may. And the first one I'm going to pose is back to you, Jehan, and that is, I guess it's sort of a bit blindingly obvious, really, but I mean, businesses have been facing cyber attacks for quite a long time now, but why do you think they are finding ransomware scenarios more difficult to manage today. And as you answer that, if the other panelists would like to chip in to that question, because I think it's something that all four of you might have a view on. But Jane, could you start the ball rolling?
Absolutely, and it's an interesting question, and as you say, I think we sort of touched on a couple of the points here. But if I sort of split it in my mind, sort of internally and externally, I think internally, I think the concern that people have around ransomware attacks is that, unlike a lot of high impact scenarios when you're doing your risk analysis, you're often looking at a low likelihood. With ransomware, you've potentially got a quite high impact scenario with a moderate to high likelihood of it occurring, and that's fairly unique for risks more broadly, but it's something that I think really has focused the attentions of organizations more broadly. The second thing internally that I think is making this more difficult or more worrisome is that businesses generally aren't set up to run technology-led crises in the way that they have. So what I mean by that is, if you're dealing with a fire or an evacuation process or a terrorist attack, there are often well-drilled processes around how that works, and Control Risk works with lots of companies around how you do that, and there's plans and there's testing in place. With a cyber attack, the same thing has been happening for a number of years, but again, quite often the idea is that you get your crisis management team together, you start moving in the right direction, but predominantly you're really looking to the IT team and the information security team, individuals like Matthew on the call here, to sort of tell you what's going on and help direct what's going on. With a ransomware attack, the horse is bolted. It's not necessarily the technology that's going to swoop in here and save you. And so it really pushes the issue back to the crisis management team to ask, well, what do you do about that? And I think one of the really good points that was raised earlier, I think by Ben and Greg, was this notion that these attackers are entrepreneurial in many ways. They are looking to understand what will hurt you the most. And so it's really important at that level that businesses start to understand, well, who are we dealing with? Are they likely to actually give us back what we need if we pay them? Maybe they don't, and in that case, do we take a harder stance? I think a more interesting dilemma that pops up as well is, well, we don't want to pay them, but we have an obligation, as Louise said, to our clients to understand what data may have been impacted. So do we enter into a negotiation to understand what data may have been lost, ask for a proof of life, as it were? And those are sort of the nuanced, difficult decisions that if you're trying to answer in the heat of battle, it's very difficult, and actually people start to sort of sit on their hands a little bit. But if you can do that beforehand, I think some of that preventative sort of training that you can do in exercising, I think that's going to be really, really critical. So I think there's a lack of that at the moment. The more that businesses start to do that, the more they start thinking about the non-technical elements that Matthew mentioned as well, I think the better they're going to be at sort of defending against this. But as Matthew said, it's not going to go away. This is something that's probably going to evolve over time, and we'll see these new techniques come to the forefront as well.
Thanks for that, Jane. And in fact, I'm going to ask an extension of that question to you, because we've got a question posed from one of our delegates today. I'm not going to name the insurer in question, but an insurer has made a decision to stop reimbursing ransomware payments from French firms. Do you think, and I'll ask this question to people on the panel, do you think we could expect more insurers to do the same sort of thing? Because I guess if they do, what are the implications for the risk management community? Is there anybody who'd be prepared to comment on that, about what that future might bring?
I'm happy to take that one on first, Julia. I think we are going to see no more of that. There has been an awful lot of saber rattling within the political community, and therefore with threatened legislation to make some of these these ransoms illegal, which is going to cause problems for insurers. My personal view is I think that would be the wrong move to make, because if a company hasn't got backups, they can't pay the ransom, they're then dead in the water. Not great for the for the. I think the second part of the question, what does that mean for risk? I think there is a need to properly understand what this risk actually is. I did see one insurance insider yesterday on the Colonial hack, where an unnamed underwriter has said that energy companies are still viewing cyber insurance as data breach coverage only, and not business interruption coverage for a failure of critical infrastructure. If energy companies are still thinking along those lines, coupled with some of the things that we're seeing on actual incidents themselves, I'm struggling to understand whether actually the risk managers themselves and the corporates have got a really good handle on the full nature of the exposure. So I think it may be the case that insurers withdrawing some of that cover for the ransom payment may actually, I'm hoping, would encourage the corporate community to properly consider the issues.
Yeah. And Ben, sort of building on what you say, I'm going to sort of turn to Greg and, do you think fines for data protection breaches are actually, we're talking here data in specifically, are there any legal issues about insurability at law?
Really, really interesting question. It depends which jurisdiction you're looking at. There are different rules and different governing laws. It depends where you're paying and what's the governing law of your insurance policy. If you're looking at the position under English law, as I'm sure many of those listening in today will be, it turns upon a principle called ex turbi causa, the illegality, that principle. And the short answer is that if there's been deliberate conduct behind the scenes, say a blind eye in relation to IT security, you're unlikely to be able to recover fines in those circumstances. But where the conduct, as it's probably more likely to be, if there's a fine, is something akin to negligence, then I'd say arguably yes. What the law's trying to do is to develop consistency and integrity. And if one thinks about it, if you can recover in relation to a data breach, a class action, in relation to this precisely the same incident, why shouldn't you be able to recover the fine from your regulator in relation to that incident? The reason it's an issue is because there isn't black and white case law on the point. But I think I'd say yes if your conduct's negligent, no if it's deliberate, and we'll wait to see if it's in the grey area in between.
Thanks, Greg. And I'm going to sort of pass to our Lloyd's colleagues. It's up to Lou or Matt who wants to take this, but I want to sort of finish on an interesting question that's come through from the floor, and that is, how confident should businesses be in the validity and integrity of backups, given how long hackers are often on a network before making themselves known? And I think it's public knowledge in the Sony Pictures hack that they were reportedly on the network for almost a year, moving through the systems before they launched their attack. So is that something, Matt or Lou, that sort of keeps you awake at night? And do you have a view on that?
There's a lot to keep me awake at night, Julia, as you know. Matt, do you want to have a go first and then I'll build on you?
Yeah, sure. If this was the sort of thing that kept me awake at night, I should probably find a different job.
Hope you're listening to that, Lou.
Yeah. So it's absolutely the case that you talk about the Sony example. This was a nation state level advanced threat against Sony, and those types of attacks do tend to have these really long dwell times. The more criminal cases tend to be shorter. They're going for volume. They're repeating as many attacks as they can. Whereas with that North Korean move on Sony, it was a bit more of a really targeted sort of thing. But on the question of backups, the key thing with the backups is to make sure that they are off your network. You're backing up regularly. You need to be planning for an assumption that you may lose all IT for a period of time and all data. And so make sure that you have those backups off your network so that if your own network is compromised, you've got somewhere else that you can bring that data back to recover from. And in those circumstances, you should be relatively able to recover.
Lou, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in the question that, and I go back to what I said, this is about creating multiple lines of defence. It's quite scary that somebody was on there for a year before it was actually identified. And that's why I think, Julia, as I said before, and it's something that Matt and I are very conscious of, particularly as we build out the strategy, is what are those multiple lines of defence, from people and cultural awareness, alignment to the customer, the delivery of those new digital services, what underpins it, and how do we ensure we have detection, fast detection and response. And I think you have to look at it across all of those layers, but you also have to regularly test as your operating model moves. It's not a once and done.
Yeah.
And I think that's the bit that worries me, is you don't do a tick in the box, phew, we're done.
Yeah. Very, very interesting.
So, no, I agree with what they said.
I mean, we've been talking today about the velocity at which businesses have been changing, and I guess what you've just described should be undertaken at the same, if not that higher level of velocity as well.
You have to, and if you think about the acceleration out of the pandemic, we're going to see huge amounts of disruption in this space, and we can't ignore that. And it's not about slowing down, it's how do you use these things to speed up, but continually check and test. And that's the bit that keeps me awake at night, is all of this stuff has to move in parallel now. So it's never static, and it's always trying to stay that step ahead. We had exactly the same challenges in the retail banks, and we saw a lot of that around how do you continue, as you're transforming, to continue with those policy standards, constant check-in, preparation, readiness, playbook, as you continue to move forward, which I think is the place that Matt has actually steered us to.
I think that's great advice, and I'm sort of eating into literally the lunch break here, but I want to do one thing before we go, or two things before I go. I'm going to go back to Jen, to Ben and Greg, and just say I think what Lou and Matt have said are great sort of final nuggets of what they would like to share with us. My second point is, Lou, in your new role, industry role, please come back and speak to us at AIRMIC. We'd love to hear
Julia, you only need to say, look, you get me and Matt. See, this is the power you have.
I won't get one free. Woo, wonderful.
You're a massive friend of it. I'd love to. So, but yeah, I feel very privileged, as you know, to do the role I do in Lloyd's. Incredibly privileged, actually. And I'm really privileged to do the Innovate Finance role, to work with the startup and scale-up community. So more than happy to talk about that. Thank you.
We will be in touch. Thank you both. And I'm going to turn to just final soundbite from Jen, from then Ben, and then from Greg. And then we'll close the session and we'll let people have a break. So Jen first, any final nugget to share?
I think it's all been said. It's and it's great to sort of get the thoughts from, I think, the other side of the fence on this. I would just reiterate, I think taking a threat-led view to help prioritize and be pragmatic about where you defend, what layers you defend at, is absolutely critical. And then the final thing I'll leave people with when it comes to the crisis management point is find your experts and apply your experts early. Find that capability, whether that's internal, whether that's external. Know where they are. Bring them in, allow them to help direct you in what you're doing. They'll start to show you the direction. You will need to make the decisions, but that's probably the single most important thing that I've learned through responding to hundreds of these attacks now.
Do it before the event, not at the event, of course. Ben, any comment you'd like to make?
I think you said what I was just going to say. The key to it is...
Well, it does get harder. Greg's got the hardest role because he's...
following up. No, look... The key to this is the incident preparedness. You get that bit right, it's then a well-oiled machine as you move through the actual incident itself. But work on the basis this is going to happen to you. Right? No, it's not an if. It's a when. And please make sure you understand the risk. Make sure the sums ensured that you've got are reflecting the financial exposures that you have.
Thank you, Ben. And Greg, I say you've got the difficult slot. You're fourth in the row, but would you like to add a final nugget from yourself?
Very, very happy to. And my thought, just developing that, is war games. We've done them with clients before, and goodness me, they can be useful because they're not just testing these esoteric points in relation to what are the areas I need to be plugged into. They're actually testing the governance of what happens. There's nothing like trying it in the real world to realise where your government isn't up to scratch in the way you thought it was, or indeed what might your CEO's reaction be when he's given or she's given the pay or not pay decision in that moment of stress and crisis. Do they have the right information to hand? Have a go at it first, and you'll be far better prepared if the worst does happen.
So super advice, and we know that gaming like that is incredibly popular, and we'll keep that at the back of our mind also for a future session. Look, fantastic panel. Thank you so much, Jay and Greg, Ben, Louise, and our colleague at Lloyd's. Thank you for being on the panel today. We really appreciate you joining us. A very rich session. I'm now going to announce a break. We're going to start again at 12:45 for a fabulous panel moderated by AIRMIC's very own Alex Frost, who will be exploring technology and digital risk and resilience. So please do come back and join us again at 12:45, and we will see you there. Thank you very much indeed.